All right, so it is that time. It is 1 p.m. Dr. King, can we go ahead and give us the go? Awesome, awesome. Okay, so hello, everybody. Welcome to our undergraduate briefing series. My name is Aaron, and I'm so happy you guys can all join us today. We have a great turnout so far, so hopefully we can keep it going. We want to share us a lot of information with you today. So before I begin, I want to introduce our team here. Our group includes myself, Caleb, we have Genesis, George, and Sydney, and we are all history and political science majors. So each of us brings a different perspective to this presentation. We all have a lot of data we want to share with you guys, and we are very excited to be able to do that. For those who don't know, we are doing a series in our comparative politics class. So we have three groups total. We are going to be doing India today, and we are so excited. We have another group doing different country, and another one doing another one. But we are very excited to be able to share all the data we have gathered about India today. So, through these briefings, we the students of Vanguard University, we share key political and global insights, and we just draw from our coursework as well. And today, like I said earlier, we're going to be doing India. So, India is one of the most important countries to study in comparative politics because it raises a very major question about democracy in practice. It's often called the world's largest democracy. It's very big, but when we look more closely at its institutions, rights, political pressures, and social divisions, the picture becomes so much more complex. So I'm going to be going over our agenda real quick. I'm going to begin with our title and thesis. Shouldn't take too long, just give you guys a little intro. We're going to have Sydney go and walk us through over India's historical timeline. We're going to have Caleb hopping in. He's going to be diving into our India's political system, the institutions and all the executive, legislative, judiciary stuff. And then I'm going to come back for our comparative analysis where we're going to be comparing India's democracy with another country. It's a surprise. For another democracy. And then we're going to have Sydney going into the happiness report. We're going to have George covering gender equality. Genesis is going to examine some corruption. George is going to come back and dive into some recent news. And then we're going to go ahead and do some Q&A, and we're going to have a great time today. We're very excited to be able to share all the data we've gathered with you guys. But yeah, so we're going to go ahead and start off with our thesis. Okay, so sorry, our question, but not right now. We're going to do what first comes to mind when you think of India politically. I want you guys to be thinking about this during our presentation. We don't want to stall too much time right now, so we're going to answer it as the best we can at the end of our presentation. So, um, when I say this, what first comes to mind when you think of India politically? Think about religion, think about democracy, diversity, nationalism. Think of some ideas, jot them down, and then later after this presentation, we'll try our best to answer those questions, and we'll go over them as well. Let's dive into our thesis. So our presentation is called India Democracy at Crossroads. So our thesis statement is our central argument is that India remains formally democratic, but increasingly exhibits characteristics of a hybrid regime. While elections, political parties, and constitutional institutions remain in place, concerns about civil liberties, media freedom, minority protections, and institutional independence suggest that the quality of democracy is under strain. India is especially significant in comparative politics because it is not neatly fit into one little category. India is very cool, has a lot of different democratic, fun things. It's not like one country, and which we're going to be exploring later as well, where we compare India to another country. So this raises the guiding question of our presentation today. Is India still functioning as a healthy democracy, or is it moving toward a more restricted and uneven form of rule? And to answer that, we're going to begin by examining historical forces that shaped its political development. So with that being said, at this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Sydney, who's going to cover our historical timeline.
Yes, thank you, Erin. We're going to be talking about the historical timeline of India. So, we're just going to briefly cover ancient India and the Muslim influence. Ancient India we're classifying as before 1000 AD, and ancient India is where we get Hinduism and the caste system, which continue to impact India today. So that's very important to India's culture and history. And then Muslim influence came in 1000 AD, and Islam brought over the Mughals. which helped unify northern India especially. So that made it more cohesive, kind of like what happened with the Romans when they unified the Italy Roman area. That's kind of what happened with India and the Mughals. And then jumping forward, we're going to talk about 1498. That's when the first European territory was established, and the Portuguese were actually the first Europeans to make a settlement, even though the British were the largest impact in India. And after the Portuguese came over, the British came over, and the French as well. And the real struggle against European forces started around 1857 to 1858. And the reason for the struggle is a company, a private company called the British East India Company, acquired a lot of power in India through trade and other factors. And the Sepoy Mutiny killed hundreds of British people in India. This started because the British brought over certain guns, and the guns had to be cleaned with certain animal fats. And those animal fats were like cow and also pig, which Muslim people with the pig, and then cow fat with the Hindus, they just did not, that didn't agree with their culture. So that is kind of the root of the mutiny. And that ended up killing a lot of British citizens. So the British government took over power from the British East India Company, and they passed the Government of India Act, which transferred the power to the actual British government. There's a photo of the mutiny on this slide, so you can kind of get an idea of the time period and what it might have looked like. And then in 1885, the formation of Congress in India happened. And when you hear Congress, you might think of like a political body, like when we have Congress in America. But Congress in India is a little bit different. It's actually like a political party. So we have Democrats and Republicans in America, and they have a political party called Congress. So that party, before India had its own government, was established as a little bit of a resistance to Great Britain, and they wanted reforms and independence. So that was their plan, essentially. And so then fast forward a little bit to 1919 to 1947 is when the real independence movement really started picking up. And the main political figure at the time was Gandhi. We've all probably heard of him, of course. And he was unique because he promoted nonviolence and also the concept of truth. And he led nonviolent movements through protests and boycotts, and eventually that led them to receive independence in 1947. From 1950 through 1966, Congress established the Constitution of India, which helped put together the political systems that India has today, which Caleb will be talking about later. And they established the government, and Congress as a political party is generally considered centrist or slightly left-leaning, but they're generally like a pretty centrist party. And then from 1975 to 1991, Congress, the political party, had some struggles. Leaders like Indira Gandhi and Rajiv Gandhi, they were from the Gandhi like lineage. They gained power during this time, and they changed the government to be non-Congress. So different political parties kind of took over. And there were political assassinations, a lot of like overturning of power. And eventually that led to, in 1996, the BJP being elected. And that was a different political party, and they were Hindu-based and more conservative than Congress. So that's just the main rival political party, essentially. And then from 2004 to 2009, Congress was back in power. So they were the dominant political party at the time. So that's essentially where I'll pass it off to Caleb.
Uh, I am unmuted. Okay. Hi, I'm Caleb. I'm going to talk about India's political system and institutions. So first things first is India is a formally a federal parliamentary democracy. However, in practice, it's much more centralized than that description would suggest. The most important point is that about the parliamentary system is it's not presidential. This means that the executive, specifically the prime minister, is directly elected by the legislative branch rather than elected separately, like in the United States in the presidential election. So because of this, there's less separations of power compared to the United States. Congress and the president are independently elected. They check each other more aggressively here in the United States. However, in India, the prime minister's party controls a majority of parliament, and they usually are able to pass legislation with relative ease. So while this does make the system more effective in policymaking, it also concentrates power in the executive. So federalism in India versus the United States. Obviously, we just talked about they're both federal systems, but the power is divided between national and state governments. However, the balance is a lot different. In the United States, the states have a lot of autonomy. They have their own Supreme Courts. They can kind of challenge the federal government, make their own laws. However, in India, the federal government is much stronger. They can actually impose something called president rule, which means that the federal government can take over a state government. This happened in 2018 in the region of Jammu and Kashmir. The state's governments collapsed due to a coalition between some of the political parties there. With no clear majority to govern, the federal government stepped in and took power there. So in comparison to the United States, there's really no equivalent mechanism by which the federal government can just straight up dissolve a state government and take control. So that really just kind of exemplifies how much stronger the Indian federal government is compared to the United States. So federalism in practice, that image there is a picture of Jammu and Kashmir, which we just talked about. That whole land is kind of divided between China, India, and Pakistan. They all have different governments there, but India claims it all. But back to executive power or federalism. I just talked about this. So executive power, in practice, executive power in India is highly concentrated in the prime minister. While the system is technically based on cabinet government, decisions are made collectively. It actually functions more like a prime ministerial system. When the ruling party has a strong majority, the prime minister sets the legislative agenda.
To your email.
They control party direction. It reduces internal checks with the executive. It strengthens centralized leadership. A clear example of strong executive decision making is in the 2016 demonization policy under Prime Minister Narendra Modi. We have a picture of him here on this slide. This meant the government suddenly invalidated large denomination currency notes to try and combat corruption. The decision was made very quickly. It was implemented nationwide with limited consultation. To draw a comparison, we kind of see this divisive executive action in the United States with executive orders. We've seen a lot of that recently under Donald Trump. However, the key difference is that in the US, executive actions are more likely to face immediate legal challenges or resistance from Congress, whereas in India, a strong parliamentary majority can allow the executive to just push the policy through. So the legislative branch, they often act more as a support mechanism for the executive than as a check on it. Party discipline is extremely strong. It means members are more likely to vote by their party. They're not going to vote against their party. Unlike the United States, we see some independence. We see people go over party lines often. So a good example of this would be the 2020 Farm Bill. We see it was passed quickly, limited debate. There was a lot of opposition protests outside of Congress, but outside of the legislation. This differs from the US Congress. They have a lot more gridlocks, which we see a lot. So the judiciary branch, they're historically very active in India, especially through the public interest litigation. They intervene in environmental regulations, corruption cases. They can also strike down laws that violate the Constitution. However, compared to the United States, where the courts are actually a lot faster than in India, there's a lot of judicial constraints in India. It's slower, less immediate. So while the judiciary is still very powerful, it does not act as a rapid check. There's also a lot of concerns recently about the judicial independence. There's a debate over how judges are appointed. The executive branch is often seeking greater influence, which is raising questions on if the judiciary can remain fully independent. Um, so the next thing, informal power structures. So beyond formal institutions like parliament and the courts and the executive branch, a lot of India's political power operates through informal channels. One of the most important is party leadership control over candidate selection. So political careers depend less on the voters and more on the party leaders who decides who gets to run for office. So it's very top-down authority within the parties. They also have a very large news. New Delhi television is the number one news in India, and it has 9 million concurrent viewers like on the daily. It's very large, and that has a lot of influence. So that's like their. So also politicians have a lot of patronage networks. So they build support by distributing resources, jobs, favors to specific communities to create loyalty. We also see lobbying and economic elites have influence on Indian politics, similar to in the United States. It does not violate any formal rules, but it does shape outcomes in a way that's a little fishy sometimes. So comparing to the United States, there's also informal power here, as we just discussed, lobbying, media influence, but it's a lot more independent here. Federalism definitely has a check. We've seen laws put in place in the United States to try and limit how much money can be sent to candidates. That is not the case in India. So, religion in the state. Formally, India is a secular state, so the government is not supposed to favor any religion. It's really that is written directly into the constitution. It's meant to assure equality. But in practice, religion plays a majority role. Obviously, Hinduism is the largest religion in India, as we can see on this map here. So political parties are appealing to religious identity, like the BJP mentioned earlier. They are very much so Hindu nationalism, and they have used that to gain support through the religion. And that has led to a rise in Hindu nationalism all over India. It's influenced policy decisions, public rhetoric, and debate over the national identity. So we can look at a comparison in the United States. We have a lot of evangelical voting blocks in the southern United States. They lean more Republican. The Republican Party very much so goes after that evangelical vote. This is very, very similar to how the BJP operates. So while India is secular in theory, in practice, religion is a very powerful force there, and it is very much so need to be kept in mind. So India is technically a multi-party system, but in practice, it is moving towards what political scientists are calling a dominant party system. The BJP currently holds significant power at the national level. It allows it to shape policy and political discourse much more than its competitors. The main opposition party, which is the Indian National Congress, has declined in strength over the past decade, making it harder to present a unified national challenge. The weak opposition reduces competition at the top, even though elections remain competitive. At the same time, regional parties remain very important. In many states, they are the dominant political force and can resist national level control. This creates a system in which policies are centralized at the national level, but remain fragmented at the state level. If we compare this to the United States, the US has a very stable two-party system. Competition is very consistent between the Democrats and the Republicans, while in India, we see it a lot more one-sided and uneven. So I'm going to pass this off now to Aaron, who is going to compare India's politics to another government.
All right, Caleb, thank you so much. So on the same topic that Caleb was, going over regime types and some power over there, we're going to compare India to China. So now that we looked and dove a little back on India's history, I wanted to place China here. Why? Why China? Because both India and China are very big populations. They have a lot of people in them. They have very deep, long histories, and they both have a major global influence as well, but their political systems, they'd operate a little bit differently. So I'm going to be going into three different points, and we're going to look at them side by side so we can better understand the differences and look at them more clearly. So the first I'm going to go into is our regime type. So India is still more politically open than China. India has opposition parties, public participation, and more room for political debate, even though those democratic features are under pressure. China, by the contrast, is much more centralized and tightly controlled, which makes it easier to classify as an authoritarian government. And this shows that India is not fully authoritarian at all, but it is also not functioning like a liberal democracy. It's not not like us. We're not like the United States. So we're a little different. So then we're going to go into the second point, which is our elections and the political competition. So in India, elections definitely still matter. They do have a very open democracy, but that doesn't mean that elections don't matter. Political parties compete, citizens vote, and in very large numbers, and elections outcome can affect the balance of power. Even when one party becomes dominant, voters still have the ability to push back. That's not the same in China. China, that kind of national multi-party competition does not exist in the same way. That makes India's system more open, even though it has real democratic weaknesses. And we're going to go into that as well. The third key point is our civil society and the freedom of expression. In India, there are still protests. We have journalists, opposition voices, and public debate, much like in the United States. Those freedoms may be under increasing pressure, though, but they still definitely exist. In China, however, civil society is very, very far more restricted, and dissent is much more tightly controlled. So while China shows clear authoritarian government rule, India shows something more complicated. It's a democracy that still functions, but there's still some signs of democratic backsliding. So overall, comparing India to China helps us see that India occupies this little middle space. So if we're talking about US kind of democracy, and then we're going to India, and then we're going to China where we have more authoritarian rule, India is in that middle ground where it's clearly under strain, but it's definitely not as authoritarian like China. So yes, that's what makes India such a valuable case in comparative politics because it's super unique, unlike different countries. So while China shows that clear authoritarian rule, while India shows what democratic backsliding looks like in an electoral system. So we're on conclusion. Let's go to, I think the next slide, Caleb will talk about that. Okay, yes, passing it on to analysis of political parties. We'll go back to Caleb.
Okay, so I'm back. I'm going to talk about the analysis of some political indices. The first one I'm going to cover is the EIU Democracy Index. India is actually 41st on the democracy scale. They have a score of 7.29 out of 10. That EIU stands for Economist Intelligence Union. It measures the quality of democracy. India, again, ranks 41st out of 167 countries. They score 7.29 out of 10, and that labels them as a flawed democracy. So the classification is very important. It suggests that while democratic institutions exist, fair elections are held, there's meaningful weaknesses in how this democracy operates. So the key question is not whether India is democratic, but it's how strong and stable that democracy actually is. So the index is built on 5 categories. Together, they capture both formal institutions and political behavior. So electoral process and pluralism evaluates whether elections are free and competitive. The functioning of government is measured by corruption, transparency, and efficiency. Political participation measures voter turnout and engagement. Political culture assesses public support for democracy itself. And finally, civil liberties encompasses freedoms such as speech, press, and assembly. So these categories are then averaged into a single score. So as we see in India, it performs very well in electoral process and pluralism, and really not very well in civil liberties. So anyway, all the scores average out to, once again, 7.29. So here we have a map of all the countries in this study. So blue would be full democracy, while the red is an authoritarian regime. So we can see here that Western Europe is on average very high scores, while Sub-Saharan Africa has the lower scores. So we see many developing countries. So India kind of sits in the middle of this, right? We see them as that light blue shade. So they're not authoritarian, but they aren't quite a full democracy just yet. So we obviously saw in the last slide that they fall short on civil liberties. So they are on a positive trajectory, though, and are moving to be a more democratic. So if we kind of zoom in here on Oceania and East Asia, we can see that India is very democratic compared to its neighbors in Pakistan, Afghanistan, China, Nepal, Brunei. We kind of see that India is really just this bright spot in that area. Very important. So if we're going to talk about India's strengths, they have a strong electoral system. They have a high voter turnout, widespread participation, institutional continuity. We can see on this graph that in 2019, they had 67% voter turnout, which is very high. That is higher than the United States. So yeah, so they've maintained institutional continuity since their independence. It reinforces the democratic legitimacy of the nation. It's a very major reason why India remains classified as a democracy and has not fallen to a hybrid or authoritarian regime. So now we can look at some of their weaknesses. And we can see that despite all their strengths, India's overall score is lowered by these key weaknesses. Civil liberties are often under increasing pressure, particularly in areas like freedom of expression and minority rights. The media environment has also faced criticism with concerns about political influence and reduced independence. At the same time, power has become increasingly centralized under Prime Minister Narendra Modi, affecting the balance among institutions. The opposition has also struggled to remain effective, which weakens democratic competition. Together, these factors reduce the overall quality of democracy. So if we're going to look at our key analytical insight and conclusion, so a key insight from the index is the distinction between procedural and liberal democracy. India performs well procedurally, meaning elections, participation are very strong. However, it's weaker in the more liberal aspects, such as protecting rights and maintaining institutional checks. This creates an imbalance where democracy continues to function, but it's not always fully liberal or in a rights-based environment. So overall, India remains a functioning democracy, but it is under increasing strain. There's a growing gap between strong institutions on paper and how they operate in practice. This makes India an important case for understanding how modern democracies can persist while still facing internal challenges. I'm now going to pass it off to Sydney, who's going to talk about our next index.
Thanks, Caleb. Yes, the index I will be talking about is the World Happiness Index. And the World Happiness Index is very interesting because how do you quantify happiness? And that's the question we're going to be talking about, and we're going to be talking about India's score. So, India's score was 118th out of 147 countries, and it received a score of 4.389 out of 10. So a little bit on the lower end. And when we're thinking about the factors that go into this index, they include GDP per capita, social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, generosity, and perceptions of corruption. So we're going to talk a little bit about the lower factors. This is a graph directly from the index, and it shows a little bit of a breakdown between the different factors. And we can see that India scored lower on the GDP side and also on generosity. And some more positive things are the household and social support side. According to the report, more than 50% 2023, most countries outside of India had a decrease in the quality of social connection among young adults. But 3 countries, one of those being India, had significant increases in the quality of social connections in that period, which is very unique because when we think about this time in history, it seems like we're growing more and more isolated, more and more secluded from other people. So that is a very interesting data point. And in comparison, only 18% of households in the US are multi-generational, so 50% versus 18 is a very stark difference. And I wanted to analyze the household size a little bit more. The index gave these 2 charts, and they aren't from India specifically, but they show a pattern that is very interesting. And it is essentially how a household size impacts life satisfaction. So they did this study in Mexico, and it shows like a U curve. So if you have too few people in the household, then you'll be less happy. And if you have too many, you can also be less happy, but there's like a sweet middle spot around 4. And the same thing was shown in Europe, almost like essentially the exact same thing. So the household average size of a household in India is 4.57. So the green dots on the graphs are where India is ranked. And then I also put the US just for comparison. Our average household size is 2.49 people, and they're the blue dots. So, as you can see, the happiness score in India, based on the household size and social support, is one of the strong points, and they're even perhaps stronger than the US in that regard. And we'll pass it off to George for the Gender Equality Index.
Hello. So I wanted to quickly cover the Gender Equality Index, which seeks to use a variety of factors such as education, economic participation, politics, so on, that seeks to address women's problems and gender equality based on, I believe it's 148 countries in the world. Um, so India currently ranks 131st out of 148 countries, which, as you can see, is on the much lower side. Um, some notable factors that cause this low score is there's a very low political involvement amongst women in India, with less than 10% of political positions being held by women. This gets even lower to ranging around 6 to 8% in the India's federal parliament and legislation. And there's moderate public participation of women in public employment, averaging around 40 to 45% by state. However, there are notable outliers where these numbers can get up to 55 to 60% in other areas. So it varies significantly in such a diverse and big nation. Another very notable problem is there's a very high crime rate that targets women. This is a very notable taboo that exists in India, where there's arguably not enough representation or police activity that seeks to protect women and help them. And as a result, women often stay at home much more on average than other countries or don't choose to participate as much in public life, which significantly affects India's score in the gender equality and is probably one of the most notable factors. And however, besides this, India has equal voting rights laws and multiple other laws that have been um, given that seek to help women and protect women's legal rights. Yet its practical effect, largely as a result of India's society and cultural patriarchy surrounding men in society, often um, makes this effect debatable. However, to continue, there is a more promising outlook regarding this. There are multiple laws that have been introduced to combat low gender equality, as I've stated before, most notably the 2023 Women's Reservation Bill, which hopes to enforce a 33% minimum for women's representation, which includes all forms of government and bureaucracy in India. But as you might notice, it says the 2023 Women's Reservation Bill, and as you know, it's 2026 currently, which addresses another big problem as even though there is significant political support for increasing gender equality and women's rights, its effect is very debatable as a lot of these laws, such as the Women's Reservation Bill, often remains in deadlock without um, any practical effect in Indian society. Even despite this, there's a very high national support for women's rights, with over 80% of Indians believing that gender equality is important. Um, However, as I stated before, there are deep-seated patriarchal divides and traditions that often hinder actual progress. India has a long history with a lot of these traditions, such as the caste system and certain other religious and cultural practices that often leave women more in the household and not as active members of society. And so it creates a very interesting divide where India is seemingly on paper very progressive and supportive of gender equality, yet when it comes to actually enforcing it, a lot of its own traditions and um, deep cultural ties, especially considering how diverse the nation is and um, how many different cultures there are pertaining to women, it often gets significantly hindered. And I'd like to pass it over to Genesis, who will cover the corruption index.
Yeah, so I want to briefly talk about what the corruption index actually measures and who publishes it. So the corruption Perceptions Index, or CPI for short, is created by the Transparency International, and it measures how corrupt a country's public sector is perceived to be. So it uses a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 means that it is highly corrupt and 100 means that it is very clean in their own wording. So the index is based off of 13 different data sources, including expert assessments, as well as business surveys, and it covers over 180 countries and territories. Where India falls on that specifically is in a rank of 91 out of 182 countries and territories, and it has a score of 38 out of 100 on that 100 scale. If we look at this corruption index on a more global scale, the average CPI score is 42, and that number has been declining over time in the years. In fact, 122 out of the 182 countries that are on this index score below a grade of 50, which shows that corruption is a very widespread global issue with very little overall progress. This lack of progress is often linked to weak leadership as well as a lack of accountability and just declining democratic checks, which allowed corruption to continue without strong consequences in return. When we connect this to this overall perspective of civil liberties, we often see that countries that restrict freedoms tend to have higher levels of corruption as well as less civic space, and it often leads to lower CPI scores because it limits transparency, it reduces accountability, and it just overall weakens the public oversight of what's going on. If we focus specifically on India, the country has a CPI score once again of 39 out of 100, which ranks them 91st out of 182. While this is a slight improvement from the previous year, it still places India below the global average of 50, indicating that there are so many ongoing challenges. On a regional level, specifically in the Asian Pacific region, many countries also score below the global average, and India falls into that mid to lower range among democracies. This basically reflects a broader regional issue, such as weak enforcement, political influence, and growing public dissatisfaction to all the countries in that regional level. When we look at corruption in India on a time scale and just over time, the trend shows very minimal improvement. So the CPI score has only increased about 1 point recently, which suggests that progress is very slow and largely stagnant. This indicates that corruption is not being significantly reduced, but rather maintained at this consistent level. Key reasoning for this is the strong connection between corruption and power. Corruption is often tied to the abuse of authority, especially when there is weak checks and balances in the place. Without a strong oversight, resources can be misused and institutions can begin to decline, ultimately weakening the effectiveness of governance as a whole. This directly impacts political rights simply because corruption allows elites or powerful groups to have a greater influence over political decisions. When oversight is weak, fairness is reduced, and a democratic accountability is undermined, even in a system in which they are technically democratic. If we look at this on a scale where we include real world examples, although corruption can happen in everyday situations, there are also so many major national level cases that highlight deeper systemic issues. For example, the electoral bond scheme in India allowed anonymous and unlimited donations to political parties. India's Supreme Court struck it down because it reduced transparency and violated citizens' rights to know who is exactly funding their political figures and actors. And this raised concerns about unequal political influence and whether wealthier groups can shape policy without public accountability. Another example comes from the judiciary, where large amounts of unexplained cash were discovered in the home of a high court judge in 2025. This led to investigations as well as discussions of impeachment, which is especially significant because the judiciary is supposed to act as this check on corruption. So for that to happen in that scale just showed how much corruption goes on in India as a whole. These examples show that corruption in India is not just limited to everyday interactions, but can also exist at the highest levels of governance and government. This reinforces what we see in that CPI score, and that corruption is simply systemic in India and can impact political rights, institutional trust, as well as the overall quality of democracy. I would love to pass it over to George, who will talk about current events and some recent news.
All right, I'm back at it. So just to quickly cover some recent news that's kind of important to this overall talk about India. Um, our first thing we'll go over is recently in February, India held a AI Impact Summit, which essentially was a big meeting of multiple nations that came together for talks about the future of AI and kind of showed off some of their creations and ways that they could innovate with AI, which is a big way of highlighting their technological significance for India, speaking about their role in the Southeast Asian area and how they could use AI for the future, which shows that India wants to be a emerging leader of new technology, especially for their aforementioned region in Southeast Asia. Another big thing that could talk a lot about is the brief India-Pakistan conflict from last year. Um, if you know about India's history, India and Pakistan have fought each other on multiple occasions, some full-scale wars and some small conflicts. This last year was one of those smaller scale conflicts, which saw both nations significantly raise escalations. As they are both nuclear powers who possess their own nuclear weapons, this raised a lot of eyebrows for the world, and it ultimately was ended after an international delegation, which was largely led by the United States and helped both countries to kind of sit at the negotiation table and end the conflict. But it showed a lot of potential for how both of these nations could easily escalate into a full-blown war based on their past colonial problems and religious differences. Another big thing to highlight India's government. India conducted a census, or is in the process of conducting a nationwide census, which seeks to measure their population and kind of show their federal government's involvement in assessing their accurate numbers just for finances and population metrics in the future, which is a significant undertaking considering that um, India, a lot of India's states are vary a lot in their centralization and federal power. And India has a significant population of over 1.4 billion. So, um, this census, in a lot of ways, shows that the Indian government is still wants to prove themselves as capable and able to address their needs as a nation and conduct um, census at such a large scale. And finally, another big thing that can talk a lot about is India's economic growth. India is one of the most important rising economies in the world. They have one of the highest growth rates in the world and are um, to them hope to be on track to develop in or to emerge into a developed nation. This is something that pretty much every Indian political party and group hopes to achieve. And as they continue to grow their economy, there is a notable raise in India's arms exports to other militaries in the world. Last year saw India's greatest budget spent towards arms exports and weapons and so on, which sort of highlights India's role as they hope to be kind of a involved in international militaries and help their allies and so on, and kind of distribute their like weapons and their power abroad as kind of a way to like, show their influence and their military strength and get a bigger hand in international conflicts or even the United Nations. So all of these kind of in conclusion show a lot of what we've been talking about India's strengths, their weaknesses with their federal government, and their ability to wage war. They still have conflict with some of their neighbors and hope to be a stronger military power. And they also hope to be a rising innovator and a strong government that they wish to show to the world.
Awesome, awesome. Okay, so thank you so much, George. We're going to be looking back on our presentation now as a whole, just kind of going over what we went over today. So, the historical section showed us that India's political identity was shaped of centuries of change. Thank you, Sydney, for that. We went into the historical background of it, we went through some key points in history. The institution section showed us that India has the formal structure of a democracy, but formal institutions only matter if they remain balanced, if they remain independent, and then if they're protected in practice as well. And then we went over the indices section. Thank you so much for that. Again, Caleb, we went over a lot. Caleb went over a lot. He went over the measurable views of India's condition today. He also went over the some power. He also compared it to USA. We talked about its democracy score today. We talked about happiness ranking, gender equality issues, and some corruption concerns. And they all reveal that political systems affect everyday life and not just constitutional and elections. These indicators show that India has democratic strength, but also weaknesses that cannot be ignored. So also we compared it to China. India is still more open, more participatory, and more competitive, but compared with liberal democracies, India still shows warning signs of democratic erosion. However, that is why the idea of a hybrid regime helps explain India so well. Again, I'm going to talk about it where we went with the United States at the top, and we have India, we have China being full authoritarian, and us, the United States, being more democratic as a government. So our three main conclusions are this. First, India is definitely still a democracy, but it's under a lot of pressure. It's not a full democracy. It's not authoritarian. It's right in that middle. Fits right in that middle. Second, India shows democratic backsliding in real time, which makes it an important hybrid regime case in our comparative politics class. And then our third, India's future depends on whether it can control and protect its civil liberties, institutional independence, and its political pluralism. So yes, there is still hope for the future of India. India still has some active voters. We have economic growth, constitutional foundation, civic energy, and political participation. George covered this. He went over our how big the economic growth was. We went over to AI. I don't think we covered food yet. I don't know if anyone has ever had Indian food, but it's really good. So it depends on whether people and institutions continue to protect freedom, accountability, and the dissent as well. So we'll go to the next slide. We're going to talk about the key takeaway. Um, India still has the structure of a democracy. We're going to say it again and again, but it has a lot of pressure on its rights, on its opposition, and its accountability. Shows that democracy is not just about elections, but how about power is actually used. So thank you guys. We're going to go over to our discussion now. We're going to have Sydney take over this part.
Yes, thank you, Aaron. So for this portion, if you guys have any questions, we would invite you to put them in the Zoom chat. And we're hoping to dedicate about 10 to 15 minutes to this portion. So if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. And if it fits better with one of my other co-presenters, I might hand it off to them. You can ask about the history, a specific index if you if you wanted to know some more information about that. So feel free to put some questions in the chat. Okay, we have a question. What do you guys see in the future of India's corruption index? Genesis, would you like to talk about that since you did the corruption index?
Yeah, for sure. So kind of like I mentioned, it has grown very minimally, but it's grown. It's gone up in their points. Over the past decade, it's mostly stayed in between that 38 to 41 range. So it's still showing a very little long-term improvement. In terms of the future, I think that we'll see some gradual improvement at its best, and we'll still have periods of stagnation, but I don't think there'll be any dramatic jumps of um, a scale in their pointage unless some major reforms happen in India. But yeah.
Awesome. We got another question. Why is it that India's government struggles to maintain order and civility at times, especially compared to China, which has a similar population, but whose government maintains a clear sense of justice according to its respective ideology? I can touch on this a little and then see if Caleb has anything to add on because this was a little bit of his specialty. I think India's government can struggle to maintain order because of the fact that it is a democracy and it stays true to that, I think China might have a little bit of an easier time maintaining its authority because it is authoritarian and they have pressure on the people to obey what they say. So I think the fact that India does have a more representative form of government and allows things like protests and different acts of civil movements, I think that is a little bit of why civility can be a little bit harder. I don't know if you have anything to add, Caleb.
Not very much. That you hit it right on the nose. I think that China being more authoritarian makes it a lot easier for them to kind of maintain order. Something else I kind of want to touch on is in northern India, we see a lot of problems up there. That is often because they are bordering Pakistan and China, and we George touched on it earlier that Pakistan and India are often butting heads and fighting and having all these problems. And so we see India's government does have a struggle to maintain that because they kind of have different land claims. Pakistan and India and China all claim kind of each other's land, and so we see a lot of problems up there. So that's what I would say.
Awesome. Thanks, Caleb. Another question. Why do you guys think that despite women rights, India continues to struggle properly to execute those laws? I can touch on it a little bit and then pass it off to George. I think something that we need to take into consideration is that India is such a large region and a huge population, and a lot of India is very rural. It doesn't necessarily have the same access to certain communities, so I think that could possibly impact it. And George, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, that's actually a good question I can expand on a little more quickly. I kind of covered a little bit in brief about how um India has a lot of problems with like they have a lot of popular support, but not a lot of like clear motivation to execute laws. And I think a couple notable reasons is one, I think India is such a religiously important society and so much like diversity with that. And I think a lot of times the very progressive government, um, I think there's a lot of like I know the BJP, for example, is a much more conservative leaning government that tries to adhere to like Hindu values largely. And I think there's a lot of times where they try to just avoid butting heads with like staunch like religious elites and stuff in the country. And I think there's just a lot of times they just kind of avoid it or put it under the rug to just like help stability with their like religious values and so on. And I think another thing that can also be a important factor is I think India simply just like a lot of their federal rule is so varied based on different areas. And I think a lot of times they simply just don't have the like capacity to fully execute a lot of these laws, even when they say that they want to and that they're big priorities. I think it's just like so far down the line in comparison to other like key issues that the country needs to deal with that it's just at least for the time like very out of the picture. So yeah.
Thank you, George. Another question. What was something that surprised you guys when learning more about India? Maybe we can all share a brief takeaway. I thought that the political system was very interesting. I didn't know much about the way that the Indian government was formed. I am more familiar with systems like the US, the UK, and I think it was very interesting. Just the structure of it. I think it's also interesting when I look at the political parties and examining political parties from another country is very interesting to me because political parties are so important to Americans. And so seeing how that looks in another country, I just think is really interesting. If Caleb, maybe you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So something that like really surprised me was how similar the judicial system was to us. They check the Constitution. They're kind of keeping the executive in check. The big difference between the United States' judicial system and India's is just how fast they go. The United States judicial system actually often acts faster than India's. I also think it's very interesting that we see in India they're struggling with, they feel like the executive may have too much power in appointing judges, and we see very similar arguments within the United States. So that I found that very interesting.
Yeah, I'll pop in real quick too. Just to kind of piggyback off what Caleb was saying, all while this is going on, they have so many different cultural, religion, and a lot of languages over there in India as well. So while there's a lot of differences and diversity over there in India, they still have a very strong yet diverse government, and it's a diverse society. So it all kind of ties in again to that universal message of India being so unique, how their democracy is a little different, their culture a little different, but at the end of the day, they still function and it still works. It's not like this terrible government. It's still working, functioning government. But yeah, that's why.
I also
I
want to
can,
piggyback off
oh,
what
sorry.
Aaron was saying. No, my bad. I think that their regional identity in like its whole is so close knit to their national identity, which I think is very, very surprising. I think a lot of people first identify with their state and their language and their region, but regional parties played this huge major role in national politics as a whole, and national unity doesn't erase their local identity, but rather coexist with it.
I could finally kind of quickly touch up. I think one thing that interests me a lot is when you look at India's like government itself, I think like when you compare it to countries like China, like we had a whole thing about who has a very similar population, they still go down the very like authoritarian, like centralized route, which I think is something China's been doing for thousands of years. When you look at its imperial history, but when you go to India, I find their recent switch to like going full democracy to be such a massive undertaking for such a big country, and just to see like how they execute it and the problems like that naturally will come with it. So I find like a lot of this stuff that we've been going over to be so interesting, considering like how big of a country is trying to manage a democracy with so many people when they could be going down a similarly like centralized, more authority focused route like other countries. So yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Another question that we have, what do you think can support national unity amidst the polarization among regional parties? I think this is such an interesting question. I think maybe Caleb can touch a little bit on it as well, but I'll give my take. I think national unity is a really hard thing for such a big country like India, even in the US. We very much identify with our states sometimes. And in India, during colonization, they kind of put a bunch of random groups together that didn't necessarily have a national sense of unity before. So creating a national sense of unity can be difficult for any colonized country. So I think if they can promote the idea of India being a country that is a strong economic power, then maybe more Indian people would feel connected to that. And if they make advancements in different global stages, it might make people want to more closely identify with the national country of India. Caleb, anybody else? What do you guys think?
I'll jump in like super quick. I 100% agree with everything you said, Sydney. You're like super right. I think that something else that can kind of support the national unity is honestly the BJP, like the political party, very Hindu nationalist, is really kind of pushing against the North. And I think if they want more national unity, they need to kind of go back on kind of that religious staunchism and just try and get everyone under the idea of national Indian unity. Just keep everyone, we're all Indians, no matter if we're Hindu or not. I think that would really help.
Awesome. Thanks for everybody who asked questions. We're nearing the end of our time, so we're gonna wrap up. But thank you to everybody who answered questions and asked questions, and I'll hand it off to Genesis.
Yeah, I simply want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate you all being here and simply uh, really engaging with our undergraduate briefing on India and just taking the time to ask questions and pay attention to what's going on. So, throughout the duration of our presentation, we explored India's political system from so many angles. We talked about its historical development, its political institutions, key indexes like democracy, happiness, gender equality, and corruption. And all of these perspectives, they just help us gain a better understanding of both the strengths and challenges that come into shaping India as a modern democracy. We would love to keep connected with all of you, and if you'd like to stay connected or keep up with future briefings and any other events that go on, we would love for you guys to feel free to follow the History Political Science Department on social media. We do have an Instagram, you can follow us on LinkedIn, and we do have a YouTube channel. So we'd love to have all of you involved. But once again, thank you so much.